give the Bengali independence movement a helping hand, as it were, the Indian government mobilizes its military forces in November 1971. As November unrolls, war between India and Pakistan comes to look more and more likely. By the month's end, it looks inevitable. In the end, it is Pakistan that strikes first in a preemptive attack against India, but war had become already virtually certain by that point. A brief war is fought between India and Pakistan, and the war eventually does succeed. Actually, it's a very brief war. It takes about a week. It succeeds in winning for the East Bengalis their political independence, their self-determination. The United States has a sort of interesting relationship to this conflict, however. Although India could plausibly be claiming to be fighting the war for humanitarian purposes, as well as for purposes of Indian national interests, the United States takes a very hard line in favor of Pakistan and against India during the war that becomes known as the Third Indo-Pakistan War. And the reason for this is that Pakistan is a close United States ally. India at this time is not a particularly close friend of the United States. And Nixon worries, he really worries, that an Indian military victory will shift the balance of power in South Asia in directions that are disadvantageous to the national interests of the United States. So when Nixon and Kissinger are confronted with a situation that seems to put humanitarian objectives, namely the suffering of the Bengali people, at odds with U.S. geostrategic or national interests, they opt overwhelmingly to defend their own concept of the national interest at the expense of the humanitarian catastrophe that Pakistan's suppression of Bengali nationalism produces.
So why is Nixon sitting here with the leader of India?
Well, this is one of the paradoxes of international diplomacy in the second half of the 20th century, is that we maintain polite conversations with our adversaries. Indira Gandhi travels to the United States in October, I think it's October, maybe November, 1971, and has a very frosty conversation with Nixon. Here they're posing for photographs, and that's a forced smile even by Richard Nixon's standards. And Nixon, in effect, warns her not to go to war with Pakistan, but India is, in the regional context, the superpower, and doesn't take a whole lot of heed of what Nixon has to say.
So it's interesting. So what you basically told us is that at every choice, America has opted largely for the realpolitik over the humanitarian.
Yeah.
Yet what seems to grow out of this is this decade of the 70s and 80s in which human rights becomes more and more important and maybe more exigent in the making of American foreign policy with various congressional mandates and so I guess the next question, the next set of questions we've not talked about why human rights are rediscovered, and you've given us the situation. So now, how does that actually translate into institutions and?
Sure.
And we did three ways. We're going to talk about NGOs, we're going to talk about Congress, we're going to talk about the executive branch, and how it sort of makes its way into policy.
No, that's a very important question. And the first thing to say, as I try to answer it, is that you need to forget everything that you've been taught in political science classes on international relations theory. The United States is not a unitary actor. The United States is a very complicated actor in the international arena, and the determination of U.S. foreign policy is never strictly a matter of presidential choice. I've talked so far about the president, Richard Nixon, but the responsibility for determining what the United States will do in the world, who it will support, who it will oppose, to whom it will send aid, to whom it will not send aid, is a matter of ongoing and perpetual political contestation. And one of the reasons that human rights or humanitarianism has durable consequences in U.S. foreign policy, even though Richard Nixon doesn't have a whole lot of time for it, is that in Congress, supporters of human rights really embrace the cause. These people are predominantly, but not exclusively, liberal Democrats, people like Donald Frazier, a Democratic representative from Minneapolis, who in late 1973 holds a series of hearings on human rights and foreign policy. They are the first hearings ever to be held on the subject in the United States Congress. The activity of sort of pro-human rights activists within the Congress plays a critical role in establishing human rights on the foreign policy agenda. Let me just give you a couple of the legislative accomplishments of the human rights activists within the Congress. In 1975, the supporters of human rights within the Congress pass an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, which specifically specifies that the United States will not provide developmental assistance to governments that routinely violate the human rights of their citizens.
That's what Kissinger mentions in that memorandum that you guys have.
Absolutely. So this is a law that in some ways sort of binds the hands of the executive in foreign policy. It makes it very difficult for a president of the United States to provide material aid, at least development aid, to a government that is in frequent violation of its own citizens' human rights. About a year later, Congress passes a very similar law that restricts the delivery of military assistance on human rights grounds. So Congress is working, sort of even as Nixon and Kissinger remain indifferent to the human rights issue, to establish binding laws that restrict the freedom of executive maneuver in foreign policy in the name of human rights. But to understand why Congress does this, or how Congress does this, it's important, I would suggest, to think not only about politics within the U.S. legislature, but also about the larger domain of non-governmental politics, and particularly about the relationship between these two things. By the early 1970s, NGO human rights politics are really beginning to take off in the United States. This is the boom period for domestic human rights activism oriented towards the international arena. Do you have Ken Shamil's essay in your reading packet for this week? Okay, so you've got an essay which tells you the story of Amnesty International USA, and it's a story of dramatic and successful growth in the early 1970s.
And we read Jared Labor's book as well, so how a person gets involved with this.
Great. And one of the things which is really, really interesting is the interface between NGO human rights politics and congressional human rights politics in the mid-1970s. Because you might think that these are sort of separate narratives, but really they're not. Non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International are very active in lobbying Congress and working with Congress to get human rights established and institutionalized within the legal framework that governs American foreign policy making. Amnesty actually opens a branch office in Washington, D.C. in 1976 for the express purposes of lobbying Congress. So, from a certain point of view, Amnesty is not that different from, the American Association of Retired Persons or the oil industry in that it lobbies, our legislature to get its work done. And Amnesty activists play a really important role. One of Donald Frazier's most important staff members on the human rights issue, a man by the name of John Salzberg, I think either came from or went to one of the big human rights NGOs. So there's an interchange of personnel between the NGO community and the legislature. NGO representatives play a really active role in drafting legislation. One of the dirty secrets of American democracy is that our legislature frequently relies upon outsiders to write the bills that become law, and human rights is no different. The politics of this are very, very important. They provide the interface between the arena of non-governmental activism and the process of lawmaking.
So that's the role of NGOs on the one hand and Congress on the other. And I guess the third point is this Frazier is mentioned also in the document that you have, and the Camille article gives you some of the legislation that we put it on the PowerPoint so you can look at this at your leisure. Daniel mentioned some of these.
There's one quick point that I'll make here. I already mentioned a couple of the laws that Congress passes, the amendment to the Foreign Assistance Development Act of 1975 and the Security Assistance Act of 1976. These are pieces of legislation that apply to the world in general. They apply to all beneficiaries of American assistance, who are also violators of domestic human rights. But in addition to these generic pieces of legislation, the Congress also passes a slew of laws that pertain to individual foreign countries in particular. And the first of these, I think, comes in 1974 when the Congress votes to cut off appropriations to support the military government of Chile, the junta that takes power following the overthrow of Allende in late 1973.
Right, and you guys have a document in which Kissinger said, couldn't you please act? I hope you read that. Daniel discovered this in his work. Yeah. And it's just, I thought, a fabulous document. Couldn't you at least pretend to have human rights standards so that we could maybe give you some money? I mean, if you haven't read this document, you should read it. It's pretty remarkable. So that's the Congress and the NGOs which push Congress. Yeah. I suppose the NGOs also are pushing the executive branch to develop a human rights infrastructure and set of obligations? That's
right. Actually, the pressure on the executive branch, I think, is sort of primarily mediated by the Congress, but there are probably other historians who have a somewhat different sense of how things get done in government who would emphasize the direct pressure that activists put on the executive. But there are really interesting sort of institutional changes that occur within the executive branch during the 1970s with regard to human rights. One of the most important steps is actually forced upon the executive by Congress, but it happens in 1976 when Congress requires President Ford to appoint an officer in the State Department who will be responsible for human rights and humanitarian affairs. This person is not initially an assistant secretary. They are elevated to be an assistant secretary in 1977 under Carter. Initially, the office is just that of a coordinator for human rights and humanitarian affairs. But the fact that the State Department would even appoint such a person, tells us something really interesting about the ways in which the priorities of American diplomacy are beginning to shift in the direction of human rights. One of the most important responsibilities for this person, the coordinator for human rights and humanitarian affairs, the first holder of the office is a diplomat by the name of James Wilson. And one of the most important things that he does, or that his office does, is to produce a series of reports on human rights conditions within all countries that receive U.S. assistance. So it goes something like this. You're head of a foreign government and you take American aid. Well, now you're going to be subject to American review so far as your internal human rights conditions are concerned. In order to produce these reports, because the State Department doesn't really have the expertise or the personnel to do them itself, the coordinator of the human rights and humanitarian affairs will have to liaise with the people who do have that knowledge. And who are they? Who's in a position to produce human rights reports on? That's right, the NGOs by the mid-1970s are the people with the information to produce these documents. So an interface between the executive branch, the State Department, and the NGO community begins to develop as well from the mid-1970s. And this is really interesting because it shows how sort of new synergies are developing between government and non-governmental politics that will, in due course, sort of make human rights a greater and greater priority for U.S. foreign policy.
Can I just make a footnote? The Berkeley connection. I met yesterday with a former student at Berkeley who was here in the late 70s, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for this Human Rights, who actually was involved in leaking, in opening up the documents which Daniel used for his work. So they have 30 people work in the history section of the State Department, which seems to be in some sense under the aegis of these folks, and they make sure that former history of human rights activity or that makes its way to public knowledge. So in some sense, the fact that Daniel could do the work he did depends on people in these offices making available the documents and producing